Two side effects that were not really part of the research, and it's those two. We stumbled across what I would call two findings that were sort of out of the corner of the eye observation on my part, who I was doing the 4 case studies. And it's out of those two observations that the strategy we're here to share with you, called SCIC, it grew out of that in the last 25, 30 years. And they are accidents. They're accidental findings. But they have guided the research that Anna-Marie and I have done since then. And they have sort of changed our lives and derailed our careers. Here is the first of these findings. I found, while doing those 4 case studies in 1968, I found that the most experienced, the most senior public sector managers find implementation of their proposal frustratingly difficult. Their proposals, they felt, were shelved, stopped, compromised, vetoed, torpedoed far more often than they should be. Now, that's not what our research was about. The research that NCHRP funded was about how to be both responsible and responsive, how to come up with solutions that are what's now called, what's in transportation, context-sensitive design. Take into account the context in which you're designing something, okay? Get real, be sensitive, okay? And responsible, okay? That's not a license to give away the store, okay? But they felt no matter how well you did that, too many of the ideas got shelved, stopped. They would say, well, yes, Hans, we implement stuff, but we don't implement the stuff we should be implementing. We implement the easy stuff. And the important stuff is sitting on the shelf. And some of them said, Hans, it's worse than that. We don't even dare address the really big problems. Why bother? It isn't that we couldn't come up with solutions, but they really can't be implemented in the political environment. Now, that is really frustrating. When you dedicate your life to a particular profession, to a particular kind of mission, you see a whole range of problems that your profession is responsible for, and you say, we better not tackle the big ones because, we can't implement it anyway. So let's work on the easy stuff. That is really frustrating. And these people were frustrated. These people were very frustrated people. After 30 years of work, they hated their jobs. They felt their best work was still sitting on a shelf. Maybe it someday would come off the shelf and be implemented, but there were studies and reports and solutions that were just sitting there. And in the meantime, they were working on Mickey Mouse stuff. This troubled me a great deal because, hey, I was a graduate student. And I thought, is that what's going to happen to me? And I was not prepared to become some bureaucrat who would only solve problems on paper and not in the real world. I had always liked my work. All the work I'd done, I always liked it. I had liked architecture. I loved architecture. I was good in architecture. I didn't leave architecture because I wasn't good in architecture. I wanted to work on more complex things. I wanted to solve community problems. And before I had worked as an architect, I'd been in the Air Force as an aircraft mechanic. I liked that work. I fixed airplanes for Uncle Sam. It was good duty. And before that, what I did, I really loved. I was a cowpuncher in Montana and in Wyoming. That was beautiful. Before that, I worked as a farmhand in Wisconsin. I had come over to this country from Switzerland. Most people think, because of Anne-Marie and my strong Wyoming accent, they assume we're Wyoming natives, but we're not. We're originally from Switzerland. And now after all this working on a farm, and I had never intended to pursue higher education, and then working as a cowboy, then working on airplanes, and now I had gone to school, studied architecture, graduated from that, studied planning at one of the finest schools, and I was going to become some frustrated bureaucrat that just didn't add up. I was not willing to do that. And I didn't have the luxury of saying, oh, that won't happen to me, because I was pretty sure these people that I was interviewing were smarter than I was. These were brilliant people. And they were politically far more sophisticated than I could ever hope to be. and they were frustrated by their ineffectiveness. Now, please understand, this is not the 21st century. This was back in the 1960s. Wall-to-wall frustration at the top levels of administrations in public sector agencies with their own ineffectiveness. I didn't go around and say, guys, you're ineffective. They told me, Hans, I'm a big shot in this agency. I have had a very successful career, and I am a fraction as effective as I ought to be. My agency is only fractionally effective. It ought to be much more effective. We have really big problems, and we're not addressing them. This really obsessed me. I didn't quite know what to do about that. But I also stumbled across this while doing the case studies. Now remember, see, this was an out of the corner of the eye observation, and so was this. At the same time that I found that, I also here and there found a tiny minority of managers who had a totally different track record. Read this sentence carefully, it is not an exaggeration. They routinely implement virtually all of their proposals without major delays. Their proposals are not stopped, not stalled, not vetoed, they simply implement them. They worked in the same kind of agencies, in the same disciplines, in the same political environment, under the same constraints, except the public treated them differently. These various interests, they would at the end, they would not create gridlock. They would not torpedo a project, even though they too were negatively affected. They went along with it. Sometimes the opponents, get this, the opponents would go out of their way to make sure the project was implemented, even though they couldn't support it. I was blown away. I was just blown away when I stumbled across this. I seriously considered starting my whole PhD research over. And I think my advisor would have let me start over because I felt somebody should study this. Somebody should study what these people are doing. They did the political equivalent of walking on water. But I finished what I started. I went out and worked as a planner in a poor city, industrial city, north of Boston. At the time had a population of about 100,000, Lynn, Massachusetts. Became the planning director there. Then worked as a research associate back at MIT, and then a consulting firm in the Rockies asked me to head up their planning department. And I did that for a few years. And then the University of Wyoming asked me to create a planning program, a graduate program, in the boom days, energy boom days of the 1970s, and run that program, which I then did for 12 years. But while doing that, much of my effort went into trying to figure out, what do these people do differently? And Annemarie, who had worked with me in that consulting firm in Colorado, and she's an urban anthropologist, by the time we went to Wyoming, all of her efforts went into researching what are these people doing, and simply all of the time that I could justify went into it. And what we're doing in this STIC course, what we really do is we share with you what we have learned from studying these implementation geniuses.